we were approached by Jim Michael, we supplied him with a little bit of information. Now what we found in the histories of Wales is what had been taught in the schools until about 1920, 1922. All the children in Wales were taught Arthur, son of King Madoc, grandson of King Tudric, great-grandson of King Typhel, etc., where he lived, where they were all buried. All this was going on. There was a centralisation gradually of education in Wales from about 1860 onwards, which culminated in the 1920s, and everybody had to be taught the same thing. I don't know whether the English government were motivated by the Irish Rising of 1916 and 1922, which frightened them, but history is a powerful weapon. It's a powerful political tool. And there are no textbooks in Wales to teach children Welsh history at this moment. There aren't any. No child is taught any Welsh history other than the bit the teacher might know. So they learn all about William the Conqueror in England and Magna Carta, but they don't learn their own stuff. So we told him what we thought would start him off. If you read the life of Brendan, it starts off, and Brendan heard of the voyage of the Teiron. It means, and Brendan heard of the voyage of the Monarch. That's what it means. And Brendan also wished to visit this great land across the oceans or whatever. And they said to Brendan, you will not get there in a boat made of skins. You must go to the men who make ships of timber. So he did. And they agreed to make him a ship of wood. And some of the men who made the ship agreed to sail with him to show him the way. Now, if they're going to show him the way, you've got to ask yourself a question. And you've got to also ask, who was the monarch at the time? Well, if you're talking about the British monarch, then you're talking about Arthur, son of Madoc, grandson of Theodoric. That's what you're talking about. Taliesin ap Henwg is well known to be head bard at the court of Arthur. No doubt about that. Taliesin means high intellect. Henwg is a saint in Gwent in South Wales. There's 2 churches of Henwg still surviving there. And Henwg advised the author of the life of St. Samson how to write it around the year 600. Okay? Samson being a nephew of Arthur of Glamorgan. What we didn't know was that there was some hiatus about Madoc, because we had stopped our studies around the year 1100, because we said, look, we're going backwards in time, not forwards in time. We're doing a little bit of what Alex Haley did in his roots idea. We didn't want to come forward, we wanted to go backwards. Our assumption was that Madoc had been correctly dated around 1170. There was so much written about him by so many people that you would anticipate they'd done their homework. So we said, Madoc, that's what's known at the moment. Well, it's a problem, because we knew in 1983 that Arthur had sailed west on the Western Ocean around 574. We knew that, because the evidence is monumental. There's not one source, there's dozens. And here we had this Madoc effort. So we said, send us some information. Well, we were sent a book by a gentleman in America on Madoc. We looked at it in an effort to trace Madoc for him. And we threw up our hands in dismay and said, you know, this is ridiculous. What do we do? And the only thing we could think to do was to go back to square one and start from a scratch position with it, which is almost what happened. There were wild statements, you know, nobody knows where Ely is. Wow, it's a big district in Cardiff, 60,000 people live there. Nobody knows who William Fleming was. Wow, he was the High Sheriff of Cardiff. Nobody knows where Mac lived, and so on. And we said, this is absurd, we've got to get this to square one. So we really began to look at Madoc again just a couple of years ago. And we found that he's harder to miss than he is to find. And that's not an exaggeration. What have we got here? What has happened in the middle of the 6th century in Britain is one of the best recorded efforts in history. Again, multiple sources, at least a dozen lives of saints, in the histories, in the prophecies of Ere, all over the place. A great comet or other body from outer space struck Britain. Right? It devastated the entire country, right across the south of Britain, and appears to have affected parts of Ireland. It may be the reason why the Scots moved out of Northern Ireland, crossed over, and went into Western Scotland. They were originally in Ireland, because that's what they did at that time. The records are very clear that most of the country had to be evacuated. People fled to the southwestern tip of Britain, Cornwall, they fled to Ireland, and they fled to their kinsmen in Brittany and Ludlow, which later became Normandy. Huge areas could not be lived in for at least 7 and sometimes until 11 years. This is probably the origin of the romance stories of Arthurian knights entering the great wastelands, which you'll find peppered all over the romance tales. What has happened is that, independent of us, fortunately, Oxford University Astrophysics Department, in the person of this gentleman, Dr. Victor Klube, has come to the same conclusion, that a comet struck Britain in the middle of the 6th century. Place names everywhere actually indicate that it did. So we've got records in the lives of the saints, we've got them in the triads, we've got them in the histories, we've got them in the ancient poetry, we've got it everywhere. Comet strikes Britain. It seems to have had a similar effect to the disasters in Egypt at the time of Moses. The birds died, the animals died, that's the farm animals and the wild. The reptiles died, the fish in the rivers died, people died, the plants died, nothing lived. All the buildings were shaken, it says, to the very foundations, the roofs fell in. This is probably why all the Roman cities and towns in Britain were totally ruined, whereas they've survived, in some cases, in very good state in France and Italy and North Africa. So they were shaken to pieces in Britain. It must have been awesome, and Oxford University, not us, estimate the blast to be something equivalent to 100 Hiroshima atom bombs. This is what happened. When it happened, Madoc Morfran, is the fleet admiral and is at sea. And he gets blasted out by the huge tornadoes and waves and winds, and he doesn't know where he is. He comes back after 10 years when a lot of people have begun to return to the country, including the king. Because the king took the army out of the country and planted it in Ludlow, later Normandy. And he took the army with him because he knew he might have to fight his way back in. Madoc comes back after 10 years and they say, where have you been? Because you can't stay at sea for 10 years, your ship will fall apart, you can't live. So he promptly told them of this wonderful, huge, vast land he'd been in, where hardly anybody lived. And it says quite clearly in one record, he was ridiculed because they couldn't follow his star directions. Obviously they used the stars as people did through all ages for navigation. So they send out an admiral named Gwenon. All I'm doing is telling you what's in the record. And Gwenon came back and said, he's right, it's there. So now they hold a big council, and the king calls all the government in and they have a parley and see what they'll do. And they decide this is an act of God. Because their country has been destroyed, God has shown them another country. That's what he says. And there's one long poem between Arthur, son of Uther, and Llywelyn, son of Madoc, son of Uther. So that makes Arthur and Madoc both sons of Uther, therefore brothers, and Llywelyn is Arthur's nephew. Interesting, because Llywelyn means coloured man. It doesn't mean black man, it means brown man. I find that astonishing. And the thing goes on through about 40 verses of poetry where first Arthur asks questions and the other guy answers him. And the king can't understand how there is such a vast country with nobody guarding it, no coast guards, no kings protecting their rights. Are they Christians? Do they have cities? You know, question and answer. And he finally decides that he will sail for this country. We have so far located, I think, 4 ancient records and a further 6 medieval records of the fleet. And he assembled 700 ships in Milford Haven, that's in the west of Wales, and they sailed the Western Ocean for this country. So it was 3 voyages, first Madoc by accident, checked out by the admiral, and then the king sails with Madoc and others. And they also brought a man named Ammon with him, who was the king's brother-in-law. The tales go on and they say how the king was in America, or we assume it's America, for 4 years. He is assassinated by a naked savage. And I find that very difficult to place in Western Europe. They wrap, 3 ladies of the court wrap the king's body in leather, deerskins, 3 of them. They place his armour on him so that people will recognise him, because they dry wither him, which is a form of mummification. They dry him out, obviously. And they place him in a boat, and 7 men begin a celebrated voyage, which is enumerated time and time again, and this celebrated voyage brings him back. Well, we already knew the other end of the voyage because we had several records, very, very clear ones, in great detail, of a ship arriving at the mouth of the Iwenny River in South Wales with a body in a bag, and they put it in a boat, a leather bag, take it upriver to Siniltyd, who is a first cousin of this King Arthur, and he takes it into a cave, and they plop the body in the cave for a while. If you go into that cave, which is still there, obviously, there is a pit running east and west. It's well into the cave, and it's about 11 feet long, very squared off, 3.5 feet wide, and about 3.5 feet deep, man-made in granite, and you wouldn't do that much work for a peasant. Later, they take the king out and they bury him on a hill nearby in a church, and the church is easily identifiable from many records. So it's rather an odd circumstance. Where did the ship come from has bothered everybody for centuries, right? Okay, where are we going with this? Right. We already knew something about this one because everybody had spotted this. They said, they do not know the brindled ox, thick his headband, 70 knobs on his collar. They're describing a brown ox with a mane, which, in my opinion, can only be the American buffalo. And here are the 7 men. When we went with Arthur of anxious memory, 7, except 7, none returned to Coelbren. Huh? The famous poem is called Prydau Annwn. It means the voyage to the other world, and they constantly alluded to the other world. Medieval people couldn't understand all this, and they thought the other world was a mystic fairyland in the what they called Celtic imagination. Bit odd, because we've already seen that the Welsh weren't Celts, they were Chaldeans, and they've never claimed to be Celts. But when they decided very blandly in England in the early 1800s to get rid of Welsh history because they were Trojans and Troy hadn't existed, of course, later on, Henrik Schliemann found Troy, and of course things took an about turn, but nobody bothered to reverse the decision. So they had to give a label to them, so they stuck Celts on their neck. It's suitable, it'll do. And this is what appears to be happening. Okay, let's go on a bit. In order to get in the picture, I've drawn this little chart for you. You can see Arthur the Black. Hang on, let's go back a minute. Arthur the Black, he's the son of Maximus, right? 383, Magnus was in Britain, married Helen, the second wife, son of the King Eudac, Octavius, and they invaded France in 383. It's a well-known history. His chief general was known to the Romans as Androgatius, but he's Arthur the First. They seized Paris, he seized the lady Genevieve, Saint Genevieve, fought a big battle with the Roman Emperor Gratian at Soissons, 12 miles south of Paris in 383, defeated him, chased him down to Lyons, said to Gratian, let's call it a day, let's have a banquet. Gratian comes to the banquet, Arthur cuts him in half with an axe. Magnus then becomes Emperor of the West. Spain goes over to them, all of North Africa, fights their way through Switzerland, down into Italy. That's why there is a carving of Arthur besieging a city in Modena Cathedral, you see, showing all the characters engaged in this expedition of 383. Down to Italy they go, another carving of Arthur, a mosaic in Taranto, in the cathedral there, crosses over into the Balkans and Greece, and he fights 2 big battles with the Emperor Theodosius of Constantinople in 388. So you've got a real live Arthur doing the things the medieval says, fighting the Romans. The problem in later times was people said,